Imagine you're a fighter pilot in the Pacific during World War II. You're flying an F-4F Wildcat, a tough, rugged plane. But you're up against the Japanese A-6M0, a fighter that can outturn, outclimb, and outrun you. It feels like an impossible fight. Every engagement is a desperate struggle for survival. This was the grim reality for American pilots in the early days of the war. The Zero was a legend, a seemingly invincible phantom of the skies. It danced around the heavier American fighters, striking with deadly precision. For every Zero shot down, the U.S. Navy was losing multiple Wildcats and, more importantly, their irreplaceable pilots. The situation was dire. Morale was plummeting. The pilots knew they were at a severe disadvantage. They were brave, but bravery alone wasn't enough to overcome the Zero's superior performance. They needed a miracle. They needed a new way to fight. That miracle came from a man who wasn't just a pilot, but a brilliant tactician. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach. Thach wasn't just watching his men get shot down. He was living the nightmare with them. He understood the Wildcat's strengths, its ruggedness, its firepower, and its decent roll rate. He also knew its weaknesses all too well. He couldn't make the Wildcat faster or more agile, so he had to change the rules of the game. He spent countless sleepless nights racking his brain, trying to devise a tactic that would give his pilots a fighting chance. He knew that a one-on-one dogfight with a Zero was a death sentence. The answer couldn't be found in individual skill alone. It had to be a team effort. The solution, he realized, lay in cooperation and mutual defense. One evening, in his ready room, Thach took out a box of matchsticks. He arranged them on a table, representing the American and Japanese fighters. He moved them around, simulating different combat scenarios. He tried every conventional tactic, and every time, the Zero matchsticks came out on top. It seemed hopeless. But then, an idea sparked. What if the American pilots didn't fight as individuals? What if they fought as pairs, weaving together in a defensive pattern that would lure the Zeros into a trap? He started moving the matchsticks in a new way, a strange weaving pattern. Two Wildcat matchsticks would fly side by side. When a Zero got on the tail of one, the two Wildcats would turn towards each other. This simple maneuver was revolutionary. It was the birth of a legendary tactic that would change the course of the air war in the Pacific. He called it the beam defense maneuver, but history would remember it by a much catchier name, the Thach weave. The core principle was simple yet ingenious. When an enemy fighter attacks one of the two planes in the pair, the targeted pilot alerts his wingman and begins a gentle turn towards him. The wingman, seeing the turn, immediately turns towards his partner as well. From the enemy pilot's perspective, his target is now crossing in front of him, presenting a difficult deflection shot. More importantly, as the two friendly planes cross, the attacker finds himself flying straight into the sights of the second Wildcat. The hunter becomes the hunted. The trap is sprung. The beauty of the Thach weave was that it didn't rely on the Wildcat outperforming the Zero. Instead, it used the Zero's own speed and aggression against it. It turned a 1-on-1 disadvantage into a 2-on-1 advantage. It was a perfect example of asymmetric warfare, using your unique strengths to exploit your enemy's weaknesses. But a tactic drawn on a tabletop with matchsticks is one thing. Executing it in the chaos of three-dimensional aerial combat, with G-forces crushing you into your seat and bullets flying past your canopy, is another entirely. Thach needed to test it. He and his executive officer, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, a man who would soon become a legend in his own right, took to the skies to practice this new, unproven maneuver. They flew their Wildcats again and again, rehearsing the weave, perfecting the timing, and refining the communication. It had to be instinctive, a second-nature reaction. A moment's hesitation could be fatal. They practiced until the weaving pattern was as natural as breathing. Thach was convinced it would work. He briefed his squadron, Fighting Squadron 3, on the new tactic. Some pilots were skeptical. It went against everything they had been taught about dogfighting, but they trusted their commander. They knew he wouldn't send them into a fight they couldn't win. They drilled the maneuver relentlessly, waiting for the day they would face the Zeros and put the theory to the ultimate test. They wouldn't have to wait long. The moment of truth came during one of the most pivotal naval battles in history, the Battle of Midway. On June 4, 1942, Thach was leading a flight of 6 Wildcats on a combat air patrol protecting the carrier task force. His division included his own wingman and another 2-plane section. Suddenly, the radio crackled with a dreaded call, bogies. A massive formation of Japanese planes was inbound. Not just bombers, but a formidable escort of around 20 Zeros. Thach was outnumbered more than 3-1. This was it, the ultimate test for his matchstick theory. The old tactics would have been suicide. The pilots would have been picked off one by one. But Thach was calm. He had a plan. He split his flight into weaving pairs, ready to spring the trap. As the swarm of Zeros descended upon them, looking for easy kills, they had no idea they were flying into a carefully prepared ambush. The first Zero pilot singled out one of the Wildcats, likely Thach's wingman, and slid onto his tail, confident of a quick victory. Just as they had practiced countless times, the targeted Wildcat pilot radioed his leader and banked towards him. Thach, on cue, turned his own plane sharply towards his wingman. The Zero pilot, intent on his prey, followed the turn, trying to line up his shot. He was so focused, he didn't see Thach's Wildcat closing in from the side. Suddenly, the Predator was in the crosshairs. Thach opened fire, and his 650 caliber machine guns ripped into the unsuspecting Zero. The Japanese fighter, which had seemed so invincible moments before, exploded in a ball of flame. The trap had worked. The other Japanese pilots, stunned, saw their comrade fall from the sky. They didn't understand what had just happened. It defied the logic of aerial combat as they knew it, but there was no time to celebrate. The sky was still thick with enemies. Another Zero latched onto a Wildcat's tail. Again, the call went out. Again, the weave was executed. The 2 Wildcats turned towards each other, and the attacking Zero was forced to either break off its attack or fly directly into the guns of the other American fighter. More Zeros fell for the bait. One by one, Thach and his pilots repeated the maneuver. They were a well-oiled machine, a defensive net that the Zeros couldn't penetrate. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to easy victories in one-on-one dogfights, were completely baffled. They were being shot down by planes they knew they could outperform. Their superior speed and agility meant nothing against this strange, coordinated defense. The psychological impact was immense. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was being shattered right before their eyes. In the furious dogfight that ensued, Thach himself claimed 3 Zeros, and his squadron shot down several more, all without losing a single Wildcat to the enemy fighters. They had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. The Thach weave had been proven in the crucible of combat. It was a resounding success. When Thach and his pilots landed back on their carrier, the news spread like wildfire. A tactic born from desperation and matchsticks had turned the tide. It gave American pilots the confidence and the tool they needed to fight back against the formidable Zero. The tactic was quickly adopted by the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps, and it became standard doctrine for fighting more maneuverable opponents. It saved countless American lives and played a crucial role in securing air superiority in the Pacific. It leveled the playing field, allowing the rugged and heavily armed American fighters to bring their strengths to bear. John Thach's contribution to naval aviation cannot be overstated. He wasn't just a brave pilot. He was an innovator, a leader who thought outside the box to solve a life-or-death problem. His simple, elegant solution, the Thach weave, is a testament to the power of tactical thinking and teamwork. It proved that in warfare, Technology isn't everything. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is a brilliant idea. The story of the Matchsticks and the Battle of Midway is more than just a war story. It's a lesson in ingenuity, leadership, and the ability to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. It shows how one person's creative thinking can change the course of history. Last time, we left Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch in a tight spot. He'd just witnessed his wingman get shot down by a nimble Japanese Zero, a fighter that could outturn and outclimb his own F-4F Wildcat. Thatch knew that if American pilots kept fighting the Zeros on their own terms, they'd be toast. The standard playbook was useless against this new threat. He had to invent a whole new way to fight, and he had to do it fast. So Thatch went back to his office in San Diego, a place that would soon become the birthplace of a legendary air combat tactic. He wasn't just doodling, he was trying to solve a deadly puzzle. He grabbed a box of matchsticks and cleared his desk. Each matchstick became a plane. He'd arrange them on his tabletop, simulating dogfights over and over. He'd move one matchstick, representing a Zero, and then try to counter it with his Wildcat matchsticks. For hours, he replayed the devastating encounter he'd witnessed. Trying to find a flaw in the Zero's attack, a tiny window of opportunity. Night after night, Thatch sat there with his wife, who would watch him move these little wooden sticks around, lost in thought. He'd try one formation, then another. He knew the Wildcat was tougher and had better firepower, but that didn't matter if you couldn't get a shot in. The Zero was a dancer. The Wildcat was a brawler. How could the brawler land a punch on the dancer? He needed a way to lure the super-agile Zero into a trap, turning its greatest strength, its maneuverability, into a fatal weakness. The core of the problem was this: when a Zero got on a Wildcat's tail, it was nearly impossible to shake. A turning fight was suicide. The Zero could spin on a dime, keeping its guns locked on target while the Wildcat struggled to get away. Thatch realized he couldn't think about one plane versus one plane anymore. The solution had to involve teamwork, a coordinated dance where one pilot's problem became another pilot's opportunity. He needed his pilots to fight, not as individuals, but as a single, lethal unit. Finally, after countless sleepless nights, moving those matchsticks across his desk, it clicked. The idea was radical, counterintuitive, but brilliant. He called it the beam defense maneuver, but the world would come to know it by his name: the Thatch Weave. The concept was simple in its elegance. Two pairs of Wildcats would fly side by side, about a wing's length apart. When a Zero latched onto the tail of one Wildcat, the targeted pilot wouldn't try to outturn the Zero. That was the old, deadly way. Instead, the American pilot would radio his wingmen, and they would both turn asterisk towards asterisk each other. Now, this seems crazy, right? You're turning into your buddy's flight path. But here's the genius of it. As the two Wildcats flew towards each other, the pursuing Zero had a choice to make. If it kept following the first Wildcat through the turn, it would expose its own side to the asterisk's second asterisk Wildcat, which was now flying straight at it, guns ready. The hunter would suddenly become the hunted. The Zero pilot would be caught completely off guard. He expected his target to try and run, not to turn towards a friend and set a trap. Suddenly, instead of an easy kill, the Zero was staring down the barrels of a .50 caliber machine gun. The only escape was to break off the attack. The weave didn't necessarily guarantee a kill every time, but it was a defensive masterpiece. It broke the Zero's attack pattern and gave the Wildcat pilots a chance to reset the fight or escape. It was a way to survive. Thatch immediately started training his squadron, VF3, in this new tactic. He took his pilots up and practiced it relentlessly. They'd use dummy runs, with some pilots playing the role of the attacking Zeros. At first, it was tricky. It required precise communication and absolute trust between the wingman. One wrong move, and you could have a mid-air collision. But Thatch drilled them until it became second nature, a synchronized ballet of lethal intent. He knew their lives would depend on it. The real test, of course, wouldn't come in the clear skies over California. It would come in the heat of battle, and that test was just around the corner. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway was about to erupt, a pivotal conflict that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. Thach and his squadron were deployed aboard the USS Yorktown, heading straight into the heart of the fight. His matchstick theory was about to face a trial by fire against the very pilots who had dominated the skies. On the morning of June 4th, Thach led a flight of 6 Wildcats to escort torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese fleet. Suddenly, the sky filled with enemies, around 20 Zeros swarming them. It was a nightmare scenario. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. The Zeros came screaming in, fast and agile, looking for easy kills. One of Thach's wingmen, Ramrod, immediately found a Zero on his tail. This was it, the moment of truth. Over the radio, Thach's voice cut through the chaos. He called the maneuver, "K Ramrod, turn into me," just like they had practiced. Both Thach and his wingman banked their planes sharply towards each other. The Zero pilot, likely confused by this bizarre tactic, stayed glued to Ramrod's tail, hungry for the kill. And just as Thach had planned with his matchsticks, the Zero flew directly into his gun sight. Thach squeezed the trigger. A stream of .50 caliber rounds tore into the Japanese fighter. The Zero, caught completely by surprise, faltered, smoked, and then plunged into the vast blue expanse of the Pacific. It worked. The matchstick trick, born on a desk in San Diego, had just claimed its first victim. The other Zeros, seeing their comrade fall to this strange new defense, hesitated. That hesitation was all the Americans needed. Throughout that engagement, Thach and his pilots weaved back and forth, turning the Zeros' attacks into shooting opportunities. One pilot, machinist Tom Cheek, attacked and immediately turned into his section leader, Lieutenant Commander Don Lovelace. The pursuing Zero was forced to pull up to avoid a collision, presenting a perfect belly shot for Lovelace, who sent it down in flames. In total, Thach's small flight of Wildcats, using the weave, shot down at least 4 Zeros and possibly more, without losing a single Wildcat to the fighters. The Thach weave was an absolute game-changer. It leveled the playing field, allowing the slower, less maneuverable American fighters to not only survive encounters with the Zero, but to win them. The tactics spread like wildfire through the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. It became standard doctrine taught to every new fighter pilot. It saved countless lives and helped turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. It was a triumph of intellect over raw performance, proof that superior tactics could defeat superior technology. And it all started with one commander, a desk, and a handful of matchsticks. Of how Jimmy Thach's wild idea turned the tables on the seemingly invincible Zero. If you're just joining us, make sure to check out parts 1 and 2 to get the full story of the desperate situation American pilots faced in the Pacific. So, where were we? Ah, yes. Jimmy Thach, back at Naval Air Station North Island, was racking his brain. He knew the F4F Wildcat was a tough bird, but in a one-on-one dogfight against the Japanese Zero, it was a sitting duck. The Zero was faster, more agile, and could outclimb the Wildcat with ease. American pilots were getting shot down in alarming numbers. Thach knew that simply telling his pilots to be more careful wasn't a strategy. It was a death sentence. He needed a tactic that didn't rely on the Wildcat's strengths, because frankly, in a direct comparison, it didn't have many. Instead, he needed a tactic that exploited the Zero's weaknesses. But what were they? The Zero was light, which made it agile, but it also meant it lacked armor plating to protect the pilot or self-sealing fuel tanks. A few well-placed shots could turn it into a fireball. Another weakness was its roll rate. At high speeds, the Zero's large ailerons became difficult to move, making it roll more sluggishly than the Wildcat. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. But how could a single Wildcat, even if it could roll faster, use this against a Zero that had it dead to rights? The answer was, it couldn't, not alone. The solution had to involve teamwork. This was a revolutionary idea at the time. Air combat was often seen as a modern form of chivalrous dueling, one pilot against another. Thach realized this mindset had to die if his pilots were to live. He started sketching ideas on a notepad. He needed a formation that allowed 2 or more Wildcats to protect each other, to cover each other's blind spots. The standard element formation of the time was a leader and a wingman, flying in tight, close formation. This looked great for air shows, but was tactically flawed. If the leader was attacked, the wingman was often too close to react effectively, and could even be a collision risk. The wingman's job was basically just to follow the leader and try not to get in the way. Thach knew this had to change. The wingman couldn't just be a follower. They had to be an active, integral part of the fight. The 2 planes had to operate as a single, deadly unit. He began to envision a formation where 2 planes flew much farther apart, maybe a few hundred feet. This distance would give them room to maneuver and react. This is where the famous matchsticks come in. To visualize his ideas, Thach went to his office, grabbed a box of matches, and cleared his desk. He designated 4 matches as friendly fighters and another for his enemy fighters. He began moving them around on the tabletop, simulating different attack scenarios. He'd have the enemy zeros come in from behind, the most common and dangerous type of attack. He arranged his 2 friendly matches, his Wildcats, flying side by side, but with significant distance between them. Let's call them Plane A and Plane B now. He brought in an enemy match, a 0. Positioning it on the tail of Plane A in a normal dogfight, Plane A would be toast. It couldn't outrun or outturn the 0. Any evasive maneuver would just delay the inevitable. But Thach wasn't thinking about a normal dogfight. As the 0 match closed in on Plane A, Thach made his move. He had Plane A turn asterisk towards asterisk its wingman, Plane B. At the same time, he had Plane B turn asterisk towards asterisk Plane A. They were turning in towards each other. Now picture this from the 0 pilot's perspective. He's lined up his shot on Plane A suddenly. His target turns sharply. To follow it, the 0 pilot has to bank hard and pull into a tight turn himself. But as he does this, something unexpected happens. By turning to follow Plane A, he exposes his own flight path directly to Plane B, which is now flying straight at him, guns ready. The hunter has just become the hunted. The 0 pilot is now caught in a classic dilemma. He can continue his attack on Plane A, but that means flying directly into the guns of Plane B, or he can break off his attack on Plane A to evade Plane B, but if he does that, Plane A is now free to reverse its turn and potentially get a shot at him. It was a simple, elegant, and deadly trap. Thach moved the matches again and again. What if the 0 attacked Plane B instead? Same result. Plane B turns towards A turns towards B, and the 0 flies into a wall of lead. What if 2 zeros attacked at once, one for each Wildcat? Thach split his enemy matches. 1 0 on Plane A's tail, 1 on Plane B's. He ran the simulation. Plane A turns towards B, Plane B turns towards A. The first 0, chasing A, is now exposed to be the second 0. Chasing B is now exposed to A. The Wildcats had effectively swapped targets, and both were now in a perfect position to shoot down the enemy that was originally attacking their wingman. No matter how he arranged the enemy matches, as long as his 2 friendly matches turned towards each other, they could defend one another and present a firing solution. This crisscross, scissors-like maneuver was the core of the idea. It didn't require the Wildcat to be better than the 0. It just required the Wildcat pilots to have discipline and trust in their wingman. This mutual support system was what Thach had been searching for. He had found a way to use 2 weaker aircraft to defeat a single, superior one. He called his new tactic the beam defense maneuver. Later, would become famously known as the Thach weave. But coming up with it on a tabletop with matchsticks was one thing. Proving it worked in the air, with real pilots and real planes, was a whole other challenge. Thach knew he would face skepticism. This was a radical departure from established doctrine. He needed a partner, someone he could trust implicitly to fly with him and test this crazy idea. He found that partner in a young, talented pilot from his squadron, Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare. O'Hare was a gifted aviator, and he immediately grasped the potential of Thach's concept. Together, they would take this matchstick theory to the skies. Thach briefed O'Hare and 2 other pilots from his squadron, VF-3. They would go up in 4F Wildcats and practice the maneuver. Thach would lead one section of 2 planes, and he put another experienced pilot in charge of the other. The plan was for one section to act as the attackers, while the other practiced the defensive weave. The first time they tried it in the air, it was clumsy. The timing was off. The turns weren't coordinated. It was harder than it looked on the tabletop. Flying a complex, coordinated maneuver while trying to keep track of both your wingmen and the enemy requires immense situational awareness and communication. But Thach was relentless. They practiced it again and again, high above the Pacific. They refined the entry cues, the communication, and the optimal distance between the planes. Slowly but surely, it started to click. The pilots began to develop a rhythm, an instinct for when to turn and how tightly. They saw how the geometry of the weave worked in 3 dimensions, how it forced the attacking plane into an impossible choice. The skepticism among the other pilots began to fade, replaced by a growing confidence. They had a real answer to the zero. This training would soon be put to the ultimate test. Thach and his squadron VF-3 were assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Lexington. In February 1942, they would find themselves in the middle of one of the most intense air battles of the early war. The theory, born from desperation and visualized with matchsticks, was about to meet reality in a trial by fire. And what happened next would not only save a fleet, but would also make a hero out of Thach's trusted partner, Butch O'Hare. Thach, realizing the dire situation, made a snap decision that would change the course of the battle and naval aviation history. He broke radio silence, his voice crackling over the headsets of his wingman. "Okay, boys, here's the plan. Do exactly as I do." He then keyed his mic again, broadcasting to all fighters in the area. "This is Thach. All Wildcats, if you get a 0 on your tail, turn towards me." It was a desperate, unconventional order. Standard procedure was to dive away, trying to use the Wildcat's superior speed in a dive to escape. Turning towards a friendly plane seemed counterintuitive, almost suicidal. It would bring the fight closer, creating a chaotic furball of planes. But Thach had a revolutionary idea, an ace up his sleeve he had been practicing for months. His 3 wingmen, without hesitation, followed his lead. They were a tight-knit group, seasoned by countless hours of training together. They trusted their commander implicitly. As the first wave of zeros closed in, Thach executed his maneuver. He banked his Wildcat hard, turning directly towards his wingman, Machinist Ram Dib, who had a 0 latched onto his 6 o'clock position. Dib, following the plan, simultaneously turned his own aircraft towards Thach. From the perspective of the Japanese pilot, this was baffling. His 2 targets, instead of scattering, were flying head-on at each other. For a split second, it looked like they were about to collide. This was the genius of the maneuver, which would later be famously known as the Thach weave. As the 2 Wildcats passed each other, Thach found himself in a perfect firing position on the tail of the 0 that had been chasing Dib. The Japanese pilot was completely blindsided. He was focused on his prey, Dib, and never anticipated the other American fighter turning into him. Thach squeezed the trigger, and his 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life, spitting a stream of tracers that ripped through the 0's fragile airframe. The enemy plane, trailing smoke and flame, spiraled out of control and plunged into the vast blue expanse of the Pacific. The remaining Japanese pilots were stunned. They had never encountered such a tactic. Their established methods of dogfighting, honed to perfection against slower, less agile opponents, were suddenly rendered ineffective. The Thatch Weave turned the Wildcats' disadvantage in maneuverability into a tactical strength. It was a team-based defense, where pairs of fighters would crisscross their flight paths, each plane covering the other's tail and presenting a difficult, constantly shifting target. While one Wildcat was being targeted, its partner could get a clear shot at the attacker. It was a deadly dance of mutual protection. The battle raged on. Another Zero latched on to Lieutenant Commander Thatch's tail. As rehearsed Ensign Robert Ramdib, now clear of his initial attacker, turned back into the fight. He saw the enemy plane lining up on his commander and didn't hesitate. He pulled his Wildcat into a tight turn, bringing his guns to bear. The Japanese pilot, so focused on Thatch, didn't see Dib coming until it was too late. A burst of .50 caliber rounds tore into his cockpit, and the second Zero erupted in a ball of fire. 2 down. The air was a maelstrom of twisting, turning aircraft. Ensign Tom Cheek, another of Thatch's wingman, found himself in trouble next. A skillful Zero pilot was glued to his 6, peppering his Wildcat with cannon fire. Following orders, Cheek turned his damaged plane towards the rest of his flight. Thatch and Dib, having just dispatched their previous adversaries, saw Cheek's predicament. They executed the weave again, this time as a trio. Thatch swooped in, forcing the Zero to break off its attack on Cheek or risk a head-on collision. As the Zero jinked to avoid Thatch, it exposed its belly to Dib, who was waiting. Dib didn't miss. His guns hammered the enemy plane, and the third Zero tumbled out of the sky. The remaining Japanese pilots, who had approached the engagement with supreme confidence just minutes earlier, were now in a state of shock and confusion. Their seemingly invincible Zeros were being picked off one by the supposedly inferior Wildcats. They had lost 3 of their comrades in a stunningly short amount of time, and they couldn't seem to land a killing blow on the Americans. The 4 Wildcats were working together with a synergy they had never witnessed before. The crisscrossing patterns were disorienting, and every attack was met with a swift and lethal counterattack from a direction they didn't anticipate. The final Zero pilot, perhaps unnerved by the fate of his wingmen, made a crucial mistake. He broke formation and attempted a desperate high-angle deflection shot on the 4th American pilot, machinist's mate First Class Leslie Menard. It was a low-percentage move, and it left him exposed. Thatch, ever the vigilant commander, saw the opening. He put his Wildcat into a steep climb, pulling up and over the fight, before rolling onto the tail of the lone Zero. The Japanese pilot was completely unaware, his attention fixed on Menard. Thatch lined up his shot carefully. This wasn't a frantic, split-second snapshot. It was a deliberate, calculated execution. He fired a long, sustained burst. The bullets found their mark, and the 4th Zero disintegrated in midair. In a matter of minutes, the engagement was over. Thatch's flight of 4 Wildcats had faced a superior number of more maneuverable Zeros and had emerged victorious, shooting down 4 enemy planes without a single loss. They regrouped, checking each other for damage, their hearts still pounding from the adrenaline of the fight. They had not only survived, but they had dominated. The tactic they had practiced endlessly over the desolate landscapes of Hawaii, the one born from a few matchsticks on a kitchen table, had worked flawlessly under the ultimate pressure of combat. As they turned back towards the USS Yorktown, Thatch knew something significant had just happened. This wasn't just a successful dogfight. It was a paradigm shift. He had found a way to nullify the Zero's greatest advantage. He had developed a counter. The Thatch Weave would be quickly adopted by the entire U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, and later by the Army Air Forces. It became a standard defensive maneuver that saved the lives of countless American pilots. Throughout the Pacific War, it allowed pilots in slower, less agile fighters like the Wildcat and the P-40 Warhawk to hold their own, and even triumph against the formidable Japanese Zero. When Thatch and his men landed back on the Yorktown, news of their incredible success spread like wildfire. Their debriefing was a landmark moment. Thatch, using his hands to demonstrate the crisscrossing patterns of the weave, explained the tactic to incredulous intelligence officers and senior commanders. It was simple, elegant, and devastatingly effective. His ingenuity had turned the tables, providing a crucial tactical solution at a critical moment in the war. Jimmy Thatch's quick thinking and innovative spirit, born from a humble experiment with matchsticks, had created a legend and given American pilots the weapon they needed to fight back and win the air war in the Pacific. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most complex problems can be solved with the simplest of ideas. Thanks for watching, and be sure to follow for more incredible stories from history.